Brandt Wagner is the head of Transport and Maritime Unit at the International Labour Organization, where he's been based there for many, many years, eh, Brandt? And yep. During his time, he's really worked at the heart of the International Labour Organization's Convention 188, which, as I'm sure you all know, is work in fishing, and which is one of the key instruments in the fight against IUU fishing. So Brandt, it's very warm welcome to the workshop, and please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks everybody. First, thank you for WMU, to President W. Henry, my old boss, by the way, the Ministry of Ocean Fisheries, Korea Maritime Institute, everyone who's organized this. And I'm sorry that I haven't been able to stay for the whole event just because of other work, but I'm really happy to be here to say a few things about the ILO. Now, I don't know, I'm going to put this up. I think I share screen myself, is that right? So let me see if you get this. Okay. Is that working? Can you see the screen?
Yes, you can. Thanks, Brandt. Okay, great,
thanks. Yeah, and thanks also Kathleen, I think she's there, and Raphael and everybody else who's involved. Yeah, what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to talk a little bit about the ILO and Convention number 188, because that's our main convention on fishing. And then I'm going to, I think I have to do this in two parts, if I understand. And then the second part will be talking about the implementation of Convention 188 and how it relates to the IUU fishing issue. So, see, okay, so this is basically, this is how I'm going to cover it here. Main labor issues, ILO, the ILO's approach, work and fishing convention. Then the second part, we're talking about tools that we developed, ILO and IUU fishing, some of our project work with the other agencies. And I'm going to talk a little bit about RFMOs because we're increasing our work with RFMOs. First, I think we all know that there's about 39 million people engaged in fisheries, everything from nice conditions, good conditions on board to some really terrible conditions at sea. Now, when we look at from a labor perspective, when we look at fishing, what do we see? I mean, compared to, let's say, other types of work, we see first the marine environment. We're working in the marine environment, which everybody knows is a challenging environment compared to other places to work, very physically challenging. We know that fishing is still a labor-intensive profession. There's still a lot of hard physical work. It's a hazardous occupation compared to other sectors. The fatality rate is often the highest of any sector in any country. Of course, vessels spend long periods at sea. So unlike a factory, you can't reach them very easily to inspect them. So this is an issue. And of course, vessels are working all around the world. We know people of course, fishers live and work on board the vessel. So the vessel is not only a workplace, it's a home. Many fishers work on the basis of their paid basis on a share of the proceeds of the sale of the catch. And this share system makes many fishers be considered as self-employed workers in many countries, and this also creates a bit of a challenge for regulation. We know many fishers don't have written contracts, so it's often difficult to inspect their conditions, at least what they're entitled to. We know that there's a serious problem with very long working hours in the fishing sector. Fatigue is a very serious problem, not in all, but in many fisheries. In terms of trade unions, the trade union representation is not very strong in fishing. So the fishers don't often have the advantage of having the protection of a trade union, which is something for the ILO that's quite important. In fishing, there's a lot of migrant labor, as we know. And, there's a lot of focus on what we see, for example, in Southeast Asia. We've seen a lot in the news about this, but this issue of migrant labor is not only something for Southeast Asia, it's something for all continents, including European countries, the United States. There's a lot of migrant fishers working in, for example, the coastal fisheries as well. Forced labor and trafficking and child labor are big issues. Forced labor is increasingly in the press. I think there's a lot more attention on that these days. And of course, declining resources the problem of IUU fishing, which was the main subject of your meeting, fisheries crime, transnational crime. These are all issues that are very much in the press, and they're all related to the labor issues. And of course, many fishers are suffering from attacks by pirates, from arrest for fishing in, being out of their own, fishing in an area where someone doesn't think they should be fishing, and also abandonment. There's a number of abandonment cases of fishers. This is a problem for seafarers as well, but it's actually also a big problem for the fishing sector. Now we know in this sector that it's also difficult to regulate the sector because it's so diverse, with the vast majority of vessels being small, under 12 meters, and different types of vessels all around the world. I mean, different types of operations as well. So what is the ILO doing? Well, first, for those who don't know, the ILO, we're the UN agency, UN specialized agency that focuses on the workplace. We're tripartite, which makes us different from the other agencies because governments have both a voice, and not only governments, but representatives of employers and workers, and that means fishing vessel owners and fishers have a voice and a vote in everything we do. So it's very important for us. And our main objective is to provide decent work for all people, including in specific sectors, which is of course a very wide, broad mandate. Now, the ILO tends to follow what we call a normative approach in our work. We base our work on international labor standards. There are two main types, conventions, and I guess you can include in that category protocols. These are instruments that after the ILO's conference, or big conference adopts them, if a state ratifies them, they create binding obligations on the state, and recommendations which are not binding but provide additional guidance on how to implement the conventions. And of course, a very unique feature of the ILO is we have a very strong system of supervision of international labor standards, where we have bodies in our supervisory system that look at reports from states that have ratified the convention and then work with those states to make sure they fully implement the convention that's been ratified. So they follow up on the treaty obligation of the state. Now, many different types of standards. There's standards for all workers on specific issues like occupational safety and health or child labor. And there are also some standards specific to specific sectors, types, economic sectors of work. So but for all workers, we have fundamental principles and rights at work. These are in conventions, but they're also by a declaration adopted by the ILO many years ago. There's something that every ILO member state is supposed to follow up on to accept the principles and implement them. We have principles on these instruments on forced labor. So no forced labor, on child labor, on discrimination at work, and on freedom of association and collective bargaining. So these are standards that apply to all workers, and they are fundamental to everything the ILO does. And I'll come back to these. Now, in 2014, one of these instruments, the Forced Labor Convention, was, the ILO adopted a protocol to the Forced Labor Convention, which basically helped operationalize that convention to strengthen the legal protection by creating new obligations with respect to protecting victims, to preventing forced labor, protecting victims, and providing access to remedy for victims of forced labor, and also requiring governments to take stronger measures on the forced labor issue. Now, this instrument also was important because it actually has led to a lot of strong action on forced labor and fishing, which is really important to our work on IUU fishing as well. Now, the ILO has adopted over its history many standards in the fishing sector, 7 specific to fishing. There are a number of conventions that dealt with seafarers that also could or did deal with fishers, 60 of those over the years, some dealing specifically with fishing, some not. But when the Maritime Labor Convention was adopted in 2006, fishing was excluded from that convention. So the ILO took the decision to consolidate all its standards into one instrument and mostly into one instrument. and adopted the Work and Fishing Convention, which is our main standard for fishing. And this was adopted with a very high vote in the ILO conference, our highest body, unanimously. And it was accompanied by the Work and Fishing recommendation, which again provides a guidance to implement the convention. Now, I'm not going to go into every detail of this, but the general idea of the convention is that it provides that fishers have decent work in these main areas: minimum requirements for work, conditions for service on board, accommodation and food, occupational safety and health protection, medical care, and social security. So that's the main objective. Now, in the preamble of the convention, there's a reference, there's several things that are referred to, but notably there's a reference to the UNCLOS Convention because of the requirement of flag states to exercise control over social matters on board ships. So we have a basis there. And also there's a reference to these fundamental principles and rights at work that I mentioned before. Now I say this because unlike for those who know the Maritime Labor Convention, they're not actually included into the articles of the convention. They are in the preamble. And for this reason, when we decide to try to improve conditions of fishers, we always promote the fundamental principles and rights at work together with ILO Convention number 188. The scope of the convention is it covers all fishers and all fishing vessels engaged in commercial fishing, which is a very wide scope. This said, okay, and basically in the convention, there are provisions covering all fishers, even down to very small vessels, but there are higher, tougher provisions for larger vessels and those operating at sea for longer periods of time. And there's flexibility provisions in the convention because we realize different states have different issues to deal with, depending the level of development of the state developing on specific issues. So there are certain possibilities to exclude from certain parts of the convention and possibilities to implement some of the conventions progressively, some of the provisions progressively, as you have, I think, in the Cape Town Agreement. Now, I'm not going to go through every detail again, but the important part, I'll skip the first part, but here, but this part, if you can see this here, designating the competent authorities and establishing mechanisms for coordination. The convention actually requires that there be established a mechanism for coordination among all authorities. And I think probably Matthew was talking before, and Alicia were talking about their work at FAO, and I don't know who was talking before on the CTA agreement, or will talk on it, but I mean, in all countries, we find this issue of coordination among authorities to be really challenging, getting everybody around the table to discuss things. So the convention specifically requires this to be established. And this can actually also contribute to coordination among authorities dealing with IUU fishing. The convention sets out responsibilities for fishing vessel owners, skippers, and fishers, and I won't go into detail other than to say that the main idea here, one of the main ideas, is that all the responsibility is not put just on the skipper of the vessel. The responsibility is also on the owner of the vessel. The fishing vessel owner is prominent in the convention. Now, I usually go through a bunch of slides setting out all the different parts of the convention. So I just put them all on all the issues on one screen here to give you a sense of the scope of what the convention deals with. But it deals with issues like recruitment and placement of fishers, how they get their work on board, no blacklisting, no paying for jobs, making sure the recruitment and placement services are regulated, minimum age, to avoid problems with young people on board, minimum age issues, child labor issues, medical examination, people being fit for sea, hours of rest, which is a very difficult issue to regulate in the fishing sector. It's been challenging for us. Many countries have not ratified the convention yet because they find it difficult to meet the requirements for mandatory periods of rest. Safe manning, including making sure that we've asked the state, where the convention says the state has to check to make sure there's sufficient manning on board the vessel. A crew list, which is also important to making for safety, for research. If you're looking for search and rescue operations, it's important to know who's on board. It's also important to know this for preventing forced labor and trafficking. Written fishers work agreement, requirements for the fishing vessel owner to repatriate fishers in a foreign, leaving the vessel in a foreign country, payment issues, accommodation. There are a lot of detailed provisions on the accommodation on board the vessel to make sure the accommodation is satisfactory but the more detailed provisions only apply to new decked vessels. We've had a lot of people who misunderstand this. They think that they have to rebuild vessels. They don't under the convention, but you would need to build your new vessels differently if you ratify it. Food and water, which of course is important, medical care on board, occupational safety and health, including risk assessment, reporting of accidents, proper training on board, safety awareness training, social security. This is a promotional nature to try to get fishers to have the same level of social security as other workers, and protection in case of sickness, injury, or death while on board the vessel. So all these things that cover the whole range of issues of labor on board vessels. Now, the convention also has provisions on compliance and enforcement. These are not as advanced, I would say, for example, as the Maritime Labor Convention, but they do require the flag state to have an inspection system in place and an effective system. There's not a requirement to inspect every vessel regularly, but there is a requirement to do so for certain vessels, generally speaking, over 24 meters in length or at sea for a certain length of time or operating at a certain distance of from port. But there is this, what we call a valid document that we want vessels to carry to make sure they've been inspected at least every 4 years. And this is where we get into issues where we can exchange information on IUU fishing. There's a part in the convention that says the flag state must investigate complaints against the vessel for labor conditions on board, and there are port state control provisions. We did not have those in the previous conventions dealing with fishing. So this is important because, for example, in South Africa, which ratified the convention, the Work and Fishing Convention, they carried out a rather well-known detention of a vessel for non-compliance with the convention. So it actually gets eyes on board the vessel in many ways. And this is where we can look at information sharing with maritime safety administrations and also with those people doing port state measure agreement inspections. And of course, there's a no more favorable treatment provision, meaning you can't treat foreign vessels the same or any better than your own vessels. Now, I'm not going to talk about the recommendation. There's not enough time. But I will mention one provision that's quite relevant here, and I think there's a presentation later. Laura from WMU, Dr. Carbala is going to make a presentation on fisheries agreements. There's a provision that encourages coastal states to include in their fisheries access agreements, something that requires the vessels operating in an exclusive economic zone to meet the requirements of the convention. This could be a powerful tool to improve conditions on board those vessels. And final slide in this presentation is these are the states that have ratified the convention so far. The ratification rate has been fairly low, but we're getting there, and we just had our 20th ratification by Kenya last week. So I can take questions now if there's time for that, and then I'll do the other part later.
Great, thank you, Brandt. Would anyone like any clarifications or have any questions at this point? Doesn't look like from the audience. Anything online? Oh, we do, sorry. Miguel.
Miguel.
Hello, Brad.
Hi, Miguel. How are you? Good to hear you or see you.
Well, thanks very much for the interesting presentation. Whenever I go into this convention, I discover more and more things. So it's a very good one to go in, even though it's very brief. And I have here a copy with me that I take it with my notes all the time. I'm just want to ask you for your opinion now. We are now debating at the level of the Paris MOU the introduction of port state control regime for fishing vessels. We are having some meetings. Last week we had a meeting, and one of the things that we are finding and is very interesting is the lack of information that you find even among the members of the Paris MOU in terms of fishing vessels. So imagine developing nations, very developed nations talking about fishing vessels, and they don't know a lot about it.
Yeah.
And then we also have the issue of people that are related to merchant ships, talking about fishing vessels. That is another problem. And then we are facing with new conventions, and this is one of the new conventions where we have to deal with. And we were proposing to kick off a port state control regime from fishing vessels from 24 meters onwards. So starting from 24 meters, taking into account that 24 meters is one of the magic numbers here in the convention itself, while others were advocating to inspect all fishing vessels from the port state control point of view. What is your recommendation?
Well, I mean, first, it's really good news. As you know, we've been fighting this fight for a long time to hope, you know, that the regional port state control agreements would take up fishing. And, you know, the Vinho del Mar Acuerdo, of course, has had something for many years, but we're really pleased that the Paris MOU is doing this. I mean, in terms of a recommendation, I mean, you know, the problem, of course, obviously from the ILO, we're trying to reach everybody. We're trying to get all vessels inspected. We're trying to even reach people on small vessels. I know that the issue in many countries is a resource issue. It's a question, and probably, and with the Paris MOU members, you know, the maritime administrations is probably a resource issue as well. So, I mean, certainly we would eventually like to see all vessels inspected, but I suppose you will probably have to phase this in as well. I mean, Convention number 188 allows for the inspection of all vessels. And as I said before, the requirements for the smaller vessels are not as stringent as for the larger vessels. So, I mean, I guess it's an internal debate within the Paris MOU, but I mean, one of the questions, you know, you have vessels, you have, like, let's say if you're looking at a vessel that comes into, let's say, Las Palmas, right, from the West Africa, there's a lot of big vessels that come in there. You want to, of course, reach those vessels. You want to reach vessels that you know, are distant water vessels that might be coming into port, you know, that kind of thing. But I mean, one also has to maybe evaluate, I was listening to what Alicia was saying before about risk. I mean, you also have to maybe look at where the risks are as well, because some of the coastal vessels, vessels that are operating maybe just one, you know, from different European countries. I mean, there are also some conditions on board those vessels that actually require a look as well. So maybe part of this is looking at it from this perspective of the vessel size, but maybe also looking at it from the risk of the vessels concerned. And that's where the trading information among the authorities, which others are promoting as well, you know, is really important to sort of sit there and identify which vessels may be, may need focus. I'm going to talk later about this training package we produced, and we actually have some guidance in there on also doing risk analysis by the authorities to determine which vessels to address. So I'm not going to clearly say don't inspect the small vessels, but I mean, I think one has to think of resources, but also one has to think of the risks.
Okay, thank you, Brandt. We do have one more question up the back there. Just
I am Dr. Asadullah from Pakistan. I have recently completed my PhD on illegal fishing and fisheries management. Sir, very good presentation. You have on illegal fishing. Sir, do you recommend or do you know any committee worked in flagship countries or developed countries by United Nations or ILO who combat illegal fishing, or IUU, or who check the landed fishing or the size of fishing, who landed in the jetties or fish harbors? Is there any committees made by United Nations or ILO? Because illegal fishing is the burning issues in the world. Recently in Pakistan, fishermen set in a protest for 32 days for the combating or control on illegal fishing. But I think there is no any committee suggested or no any committee made by UNO or ILO who combat, who check and balance in the developing countries. So do you suggest me? the committee or anything made by UNO?
Well, I think, thank you for your question. And I mean, a lot of this really actually applies probably more to Matthew and Alicia than me in some ways. But I mean, what our first, the aspiration, the dream is that we have vessels that are inspected for both illegal fishing. So the Port State Measures Agreement is, I think, the tool for that. But we also are looking that those vessels be inspected for safety, which the Cape Town Agreement of the IMO should take care of. Once that convention's enforced, that will strengthen the role of port states to inspect those vessels. And at the same time, we're also making sure that the conditions on board those vessels are inspected. So the labor conditions on board are inspected. So, I mean, I think, again, my colleagues from FAO can speak more to what's being done on what is defined as IUU fishing. But what we're trying to do is work with them to share information and coordinate our work so that we also reach these other matters as well. And, you know, the dream is also that if a Port State Measures Agreement inspector who's going on board to check, you know, the equipment used or the fish that's caught, if they see something which is unsafe, that they would know who to turn to inform them, so that could be inspected by a safety inspector. And if they see something like an indication of forced labor or other problems on board for the fishers, that they would also know who to turn to have that checked. And the same with the others, so that if they labor, or somebody goes on board because there's an issue of labor problems on board, forced labor, or just bad working conditions on board, and they see something that does not look right with respect to the catch, they may also be able to share information with the people who are responsible for that as well. It's this sharing of information that everybody really has been talking about that's vitally important. And then making sure that the people who have the inspection have the legal authority and the training to inspect whatever it is that they're inspecting on the vessel. That's kind of what we're aiming for.
Okay, thank you, Brandt. I think you can continue on with your presentation now.
Oh, the second thing. Okay, all right. Well, the second part here, sorry, I just put this up on the screen. And I'll try not to go at great length. It just takes a second to put this up. Is more focused on the IUU fishing issue. So pardon me just for a moment while I move this over. I thought you had the presentation, but anyway. And all right, can you see the screen? Can you see the screen?
Hi, Brandt. Yes, we can see the screen.
Okay, good. Really quickly on this one. Okay, the ILO adopted the Work and Fishing Convention, and when we adopted our conference, which is a meeting of thousands of people, they said they adopted certain resolutions telling us to follow up on the convention, and we developed a plan of action. This was actually when Dr. Doumbia Henry was with us, built the ILO to do this. So we developed a plan to move forward, and we did this. So let me talk first about the promotion of the standards briefly. And what we've done in the ILO, and this is to share this because we can't talk about everything in this one presentation, is we developed a lot of different publications and tools to help states ratify and implement the convention. So these are almost all online and free. You can see these on the ILO website, which I'll give you at the end of the meeting. Now, one of the things we find very important, and I know that this is done also with the Port State Measures Agreement and Cape Town Agreement, is we want states to do a gap analysis where they look at the provisions of our convention and maybe also the recommendation that helps implement it, and they look at their national laws and regulations and see what's maybe missing from the national laws and regulations So that's a gap. And then identify what has to be changed in national laws and regulations to fill the gap. And we've done this in many different countries. We're doing it as we speak today in different countries. And the result is often, sometimes it can be result in, after a lot of discussion, tripartite discussion in the country. We want not only the government people, the people from different ministries, but the fishing vessel owners and the representatives of fishers involved. This often leads to changing different pieces of laws or different laws or regulations, or like it did in Thailand, it can lead to developing a whole Fishing Labor Act, which addresses the main issues in Convention number 188 and perhaps other issues. Now, to help states when they go through this process, because I mentioned there's a lot of flexibility provisions in the convention, we've also developed information on how to use the flexibility provisions. That's one tool. I mentioned our supervisory system, where we have this advanced system, including the ILO's Committee of Experts on Application of Conventions and Recommendations, which is, there are 20 eminent jurists from around the world who do this. States have to submit a report to the ILO on what they've done to implement the convention. So there's a form for that. And this asks for information that the ILO can then use to assess if the state is fully implementing the convention or not, and then help the state to move forward to fully implement it or apply it. And that's happening even now. Those states who've ratified the fishing convention are going through this process. Flag state and port state control guidelines. We develop guidelines on both port state control. So what a port state would do to inspect a vessel for compliance with convention number 188, and flag state inspection, flag state control. And the flag state control guidelines was done a little bit later, so I think it's a little bit more informative. So it talks about setting up the inspection system, the different types of inspections, this question of using, inspecting based on risk. There's a specific guidance on how to inspect different issues. Now, I'm going to switch a little bit. Now, when we talk about IUU fishing, a lot of people say, well, how is there, is there really a link between IUU fishing and labor issues? This has been going on for a long time. Even when this was discussed many years ago by the FAO IMO IUU fishing working group, we tried actually to put labor into this definition of IUU fishing, and we didn't succeed. But over time, people have recognized that there's a link. And for us in the ILO, as a UN agency, it was important that in 2013, at one of our meetings, there was a clear statement by all parties, governments, fishing vessel owners, trade unions, saying, yes, there's a link. IUU fishing leads to exploitative labor practices. IUU fishing may be involved in forced labor and trafficking and child labor. So now we start seeing this link. Then we see how Convention number 188, besides addressing living and working conditions, can also help contribute to dealing with IUU issues by addressing the conditions of migrant fishers and addressing forced labor and trafficking, because it would appear that often if you're doing something illegally, like illegal fishing, you may also be engaged in other illegal labor practices like forced labor. So that was important for us. Now, we have a lot of, how are we following up on all this? Well, first, we have a lot of development cooperation. These are like projects and things where we try to help states or countries to implement the convention. Well, I mentioned before that in 2014, the ILO adopted the protocol to the Forced Labor Convention. Well, that was a big step because that actually helped also get us moving a lot more on dealing with forced labor and fishing. We had a big meeting on this in Oslo, in Norway, where we talked a lot about these issues and the links, again, between labor and IUU fishing. We've had some major projects. We had a very successful project funded by the European Union was in Thailand, where Thailand, the main things of this project were to put in place a legal and regulatory framework based on convention on the protocol of 2014 on the Forced Labor Convention and Convention number 188 to improve labor inspection to work also on voluntary compliance initiatives, and to empower the workers concerned. Now, I won't go into detail, but this project led to the ratification of both the protocol to the Forced Labor Convention and Convention number 188. This is very important because now Thailand has put in place, as I mentioned, the Fisheries Labor Act, and Thailand has submitted their report to the ILO supervisory system, and we are working now to help Thailand move towards full implementation of the convention. We had another project funded, I think this was by the United States. This was a project in Southeast Asia, which was aimed at reducing trafficking and labor exploitation in fishing and strengthening coordination and increasing efficiency of efforts at the national and regional level. Now, this project set up a coordination mechanism to deal with these issues, but there was a lot of interaction here between fisheries agencies, even police, and also a labor agencies to deal with this, because there was a recognition that the information that came out of inspections for IUU fishing was valuable for dealing with labor issues. So a lot came out of that project, and which is now over. Now, we took the information from states that have ratified the convention, including practical experiences, and we took experiences from these projects, and then we developed this training package on inspecting fishing vessels. Now, this training package, I won't go into great detail, but it's in English, French, and Spanish. It's on the web and on the internet site, and it sets up this whole system. It talks about doing a pre-mapping exercise of all the different authorities concerned in the country. It sets up a program for managers. It has guidance on training inspectors. It not only talks about Convention 188, but also touches on inspection of fundamental principles and rights at work, including forced labor. So this is a tool. Now, this tool isn't just people talking from Geneva. This brings into it the experiences of many states, like Thailand, South Africa, United Kingdom, many others. And we try to provide this so that we actually can help people move forward. And we're making an online version of this training course this year, which we hope will be available soon, also in English, French, and Spanish, so we can do this at a lower cost. We currently have a project in place, a new project, the Ship to Shore project in Southeast Asia, which is focusing kind of on the migrant labor aspect of fishing, but this is aimed again at catching these issues at the source, the problems of recruitment and placement, which lead to trafficking and forced labor of fishers, and putting in place a framework of rights of fishers in the country. So we are working at the recruitment side, but also trying to put in place Convention number 188 and make sure that the fundamental principles and rights at work are implemented in these countries, and very importantly, empowering the people in the countries concerned, empowering the trade unions, helping them strengthen, because they may be the ones who have the information that needs to be reported to the states. Another recent project, this has just been established funded by Norway. This is focusing generally on forced labor and child labor worldwide. And that project, the decision was taken to focus initially on fishing. So this has helped us start doing a lot more work on forced labor in fishing. And again, all this work still also promotes Convention number 188. And just to give an example, because this is where it's kind of interesting, we're looking at the understanding obstacles to detecting forced labor on fishing vessels, understanding the elements of these detection programs that need to be in place, developing tools and protocols so when somebody sees a forced labor situation, right, they know how to report it. I mentioned this before. So for example, if we want to, a port state measures agreement person sees forced labor, something that looks like forced labor, they have some training on what that means. And then they also have determined the protocols in the country so they know who to tell about this, right? And so this is the kind of thing this project is doing. I mean, it's much longer, but this is very important. Now, if we look here, this is the general indicators of forced labor on a fishing vessel. These are generic for all sectors in the ILO. So we're trying to take these these elements and look at them in the context of fishing. So what does it mean? Because things like isolation and fishing, it's a bit different than working in a factory ashore. So we're working on tools that will be out soon to help on that. Now, we also have a new project we started in Peru and Ecuador. So we're moving again to more work in Latin America on violations of labor rights in fishing. Now, going back, we talked about interagency cooperation. I'm sure the others, I'm sure Matthew and Alicia were talking about this. We had a strong call in a meeting in 2017. We had a big meeting on migrant labor and fishing. And one of the things that came out of that was this really strong request to work strongly with the other UN agencies to promote not only Convention 188, but the Cape Town Agreement and the Port State Measures Agreement, and also the SDCWF Convention. So that was a big message for us. And because of that, we've been working very closely with the IMO to promote the Cape Town Agreement, the FAO on the Port State Measures to promote the Port State Measures Agreement, and we become a full member of the what used to be the FAO-IMO Joint Working Group on IUU fishing. So now it's the FAO-ILO-IMO Joint Working Group. So this is helping to create this exchange at the international level of experiences and work to make sure that we address all these issues together: IUU fishing, safety, labor issues. Now, what this has led to is increased interest in the role of regional fisheries management organizations in labor issues. I mean, this is a general interest in the world. This for the ILO these working together with FAO and IMO has been very helpful on this. So now I put on the screen, I won't read them all, but there are a lot of regional fisheries management organizations that are starting to get interested in and looking more closely into labor issues. Because as we know, when it comes, I mean, we have port state control provisions and flag state control provisions, but regional fisheries management organizations have better access to vessels at sea, you know? So this is all sort of the developing work. It's kind of exciting. The question is, in the end, what kind of information can be exchanged? And also the question is, what can a fisheries management organization do? Because it's not necessarily inspecting in a capacity as a flag state or a port state. It's doing it in a different way. So this is all the frontier of this work. And we're working closely with FAO and these regional bodies to figure out how this will work and move forward. And we really appreciate the regional fisheries management organizations that are doing this. We're also working in this exchange of information between IOTC and the Indian Ocean MOU, because we have two different agreements that are regional and based, you know, on inspection of vessels that can share information, see how we can exchange information and experiences on inspection. So anyway, I'll close this bit. And I mean, we're trying, what we're hoping out of this, I mean, participating in this event. First, we're looking for the, you know, to promote obviously ratification and implementation of Convention number 188, and also the fundamental principles and rights at work on fishing vessels, because we need to reach them. And we also strongly promote not only the ratification and implementation of our own conventions, but the IMO and FAO conventions. And we're trying to raise awareness in this way and we're looking for ways of improving the coordination of efforts and also exchange of information. So when Alicia, I think, and Matthew were talking before about, I mean, people talk about the global record, we're looking at how we can use these tools as well to help achieve some of our objectives. So thanks, that's, and if you want more information on all this stuff, we also have a website where you can get most of the information on what we do.
Thank you very much, Brandt. And I think fascinating we're starting to see how this interagency cooperation and overlaps of areas of expertise and legislation is really the core of what we want to get to in this workshop. However, if it's okay with you, Brandt, I think we want to save questions for the panel session because we want to keep to time and we have a copy. We still have 2 more presentations to go this afternoon. So hopefully we'll see you back at the panel session, Brandt.
Okay.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. And we'll meet back here in half an hour.